So from the future to firmly in the past, I'm going to be sharing the story of Kathleen Kleiman and her experience at Camp Easter Seals. And this story arrived personally to us at the History Center, delivered by Tina Calabro, who's a close colleague of ours, who's worked collaboratively with us for years to preserve the historic struggle of Western Pennsylvanians with disabilities in their pursuit of human and civil rights. And honestly, as frequently been the case, she had a connection with the donor of this collection, with Kathleen, and knew how her story fit into broader disability history. And we, again and again, have been the beneficiaries of this knowledge. So Kathleen Kleiman herself is a revered disability rights advocate in the region. And the records that I'll be highlighting today are those that document her time at a camp for disabled children in the 1960s. When I heard about this, I could not wait to take a look inside this collection. And I'm not sure about y'all, but my thoughts immediately jumped to Crip Camp, the 2020 Netflix documentary that follows a group of disabled teens during their time at a similar camp in the Catskills. Since seeing the film and then working collaboratively with the disability community over the years to preserve their histories, I'd often wondered if there was a Pittsburgh or Western Pennsylvania version of this camp. And here was my answer. The items in the box read like a time capsule of Kathleen's time at camp. I really could almost feel the emotional weight of each item as I pulled it out of the box, from the book of camp songs to the commemorative patch from 1966, and then finally to some weathered newsletters from the camp. Rounding out the set were a significant stack of letters, as well as a handful of photographs. I had a long familiar sensation that there was a much bigger story here that I needed to pursue. So I reached out to Kathleen and asked her to set up a time to speak. And it turns out that I needn't have prepared any questions for our first conversation, because she just grabbed my hand and graciously led me back in time to vivid memories of her time at camp and the central role that it played in her life. She told me that she couldn't wait for the arrival of Camp Easter Seal each summer. For a few weeks every year, Kathleen escaped the confines of her protective family and was free to just be another kid at summer camp, exploring nature and making memories with her friends. Her journey began with a drop-off at the Easter Seal Society headquarters in downtown Pittsburgh. And on this slide, we see a couple of campers boarding a bus in 1962 to go to the camp. From there, she and her fellow campers were transported to rural Somerset County on the grounds of Laurel Hill State Park. Somewhere along the lines, all the kids all shed the same defining trait. As Kathleen tells it, Camp Easter Seal was the one and only place for her where, in her words, being disabled was absolutely normal. Western Pennsylvania Camp Easter Seal began in the summer of 1949 as a recreational camp for disabled children from across the state. The camp was an initiative of the Easter Seal Society, a longstanding organization that serves the needs of children and adults with disabilities. Kathleen went to her first camp session in 1960. She went faithfully for the next decade. She started going when she was 10 years old and went for her last summer at the age of 20. I could tell quickly how vividly Kathleen was revisiting this time in her life during our conversations, just by the look on her face and the way that she talked to me about her average day. Kathleen's day started at 7 a.m. with a bugle call blasting through the forest. Campers had the next 40 minutes to prep their breakfast. First thing though, the necessities of the night before had to be dealt with. Given the secluded location of the cabins, campers were not permitted to trek to the restrooms throughout the night. They were presented with an arcane but very functional alternative, a metal can. Each morning, one camper had the unsavory duty of walking the can to the restroom and flushing its contents down the toilet. Because Kathleen used braces, she was happily out of this unfortunate rotation. Far from retrofitted for kids with physical disabilities, the grounds of Laurel Hill State Park were rugged, just like we know in this region in Western Pennsylvania, and the cabins were somewhat remote compared to where the camp activities took place. So this was not a space that was ADA accessible to kids with disabilities. Unfazed though, the group trekked from their cabins to the only level section of the campground where they stood in formation as the American flag was raised. Next was breakfast, and with all meal times came the expectation that campers would clean their plates. Kathleen complied with one exception, dreaded cantaloupe. She had a habit of throwing it under the table rather than eating it, which seems to have worked for her during her 10 years at camp. After making their beds, campers were free to choose from a variety of activities. They could take morning hikes, catch butterflies, identify wildflowers, create arts and crafts, catch frogs, and the like. After lunch was rest time for the campers. As Kathleen tells it, rest time was absolute agony. It was around 1 p.m, and all the campers, from the youngest all the way to the teenagers, had to lie down and take a nap. Their weeks at camp were also defined by group activities like campfire singing, baseball games, and the like. For once, they weren't held back. Here's Kathleen sharing a particularly vivid memory.
They had some sort of Olympic Games one summer, and they had this severely disabled little boy, and they matched me up with him and put boxing gloves on us, and he pretty much knocked my lights out. He was so good and I was so bad, but you know, I mean, he had the biggest grin on his face. No, you could tell nobody had ever put boxing gloves on this little kid before.
Yeah.
And we were similar aged.
Yeah.
And here he was hitting a girl. And I was a little stronger than him, but I couldn't beat him. I was cowed. But to have an opportunity to have boxing gloves on, and go ahead and hit somebody. I mean, that disabled kids don't get that experience.
No, right.
It would think that up.
Right.
That's insane.
Wow.
My mother knew half of what I did at camp. She would have been horrified. Horrified.
Kathleen and her peers spent many an afternoon at the Camp Easter Seal Beach along the shore of Laurel Hill Lake. Given the rugged campground, Kathleen and some of her fellow campers needed assistance to get to the beach. Referred to as Jeep riders, these kiddos were loaded into the back of a station wagon and transported without seatbelts along utility roads to get to the beach. From there, they were loaded onto the shoulders of counselors in a firefighter hold to be reunited with their friends. Kathleen vividly recalls swimming in the ice-cold water of the lake. Needless to say, she spent most of her time on the beach, hanging out with her friends under the sun. Kathleen fondly recalls camp as a place where disability just dropped out as a common denominator, so all the other little social aspects of their little society could play out. As is the case with countless children, camp was where Kathleen and her friends spent portions of their formative years. It was a unique place where she shed her shyness and was finally free to explore her identity outside of her disability. It was a place where she could rejoice in inside jokes and recite camp songs by heart. It was a place where she could dream and discover a future in the face of such broad marginalization and stigma outside of camp. The camp's crescendo each year was a dance. As these things go, campers were expected to bring a date or face the peril of being matched by the camp counselors. Kathleen treasures the 2 years that a certain fellow camper named Paul Spudich took her to the dance. Here, the two are dressed in matching brown and white at the 1968 summer dance. Meeting Paul had a life-altering impact on Kathleen. Here was a kid, also from Pittsburgh suburbs, who had a distinct vision for his future and who didn't seem to be shackled by society's limited expectations for disabled people. This was striking to Kathleen, who spent her life struggling against the confines placed on her by her family, by her schooling, and beyond. Outside of life at camp, Kathleen didn't attend her neighborhood elementary school in Wilmerding. She was sent instead to Electric Heights School for Children with Disabilities. The environment was like a one-room schoolhouse with multiple grades and learning levels all in the same space. Kathleen did not have a cognitive disability, but spent years learning out of the same third grade textbook. This continued until a teacher intervened finally and successfully advocated for her transfer to a typical school. This sadly was not an uncommon experience for disabled children during the mid-1970s. In fact, schools were overwhelmingly inaccessible to children with disabilities. Even worse, public schools frequently turned disabled children away until the 1972 Right to Education Consent Decree finally made it illegal for them to do so. Now, in contrast, Paul's disability did not impede him from a public education, nor did his family place limitations on his future career prospects. Kathleen saw the benefit of that, and not just at camp. The two struck up a regular correspondence. Here's Kathleen on what that meant to her in moments, especially when the world was trying to hold her back.
And focused on Paul, who was out there going to college, doing what he wanted to do. He had summer jobs. He would write me about the summer jobs. He'd write me about the activities in college. It made me see a future for myself. And that was the importance of those letters.
If there ever was a doubt, Kathleen did chart quite a future for herself. In her own words.
But it was all these kids with at camp that when I finally was at a place where I was married with children and had 2 master's degrees, it was like I want to be with those people I love. I want to be with my other brothers and sisters.
Wow.
I was getting a lot of crap from my husband saying, you should do this, you'd be making a lot of money. And I said, no, that's your job to make money. My job is to do what I want to do.
Yeah.
And I want to be with my people, and I want to help them solve our issues. There's things going on I think I can help on this.
Kathleen went on to forge a remarkable career in disability services and independent living that is definitely impossible to shrink down for the purposes of this presentation, but here's my best attempt. Kathleen entered her field at a time when people with physical disabilities had begun organizing at a scale that demanded attention. This was years before the passage of the ADA. One of the core facets of the movement at the time was a push to secure the right to live independently. Prior to the 1970s, disabled people with significant support needs had incredibly limited options as they grew into adulthood. They were essentially live at home with family without the necessary supports, be confined to a large state-run institution, or live in a nursing home. Pioneers like Ed Roberts created a fourth option, birthing the independent living movement, which introduced centers for independent living. These CILs were run by the disability community for the disability community. They were part community center, part library, part advocacy organization, part social service provider that are essential conduits to the needs and aspirations of people with complex disabilities. It's astounding to consider Kathleen's trajectory had it not been for Paul and Camp Easter Seal. Remarkable too, that as much as camp was the fixture in Kathleen's life that cemented her future in disability support services, it was also simultaneously the place where her disability melted away. As an archivist, I'll never get over the generosity of people like Kathleen and Amy Selders, another journeywoman of the independent living movement whose quilt documenting so many significant chapters in the disability rights movement is depicted on this slide. 8 years ago, we at the History Center were largely unfamiliar with these significant themes in our region's history that related to disability. But through collaboration with the Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium, and through individual people's willingness to share their stories and their collections with us, we've had the honor of utilizing some of the tools that we share, just some of the tools that we have to share these narratives. I try to make no mistake about how fragile these stories are. If not shared and preserved for the record, they risk being lost and unrecoverable to a depth and breadth that honors a past reality lived by people like Kathleen. I would not be able to share this story today if it were not for the series of Zoom chats that we shared, And so I continue to thank them and work collaboratively with them to preserve their stories. Thank you.